Hi guys, it's Kelly Lanivola here, and I am back with another What Would Kelly Make? And today we are going to be making a trifold window card. So of the parcels that I got, I decided I was going to work with Memory Box Love Grows Stamps and Dies. So if you guys have watched the series before, you know I get mailed some parcels, and then each one's paired with a technique. And typically the technique is what decides what stamp set or what package I'm going to use. I'm also going to be using the Stitch Rectangles die from Simon Says Stamp for the window. So I have a piece of 11 by 5.5 cardstock, and I'm putting this in my paper trimmer, but I'm actually going to use it to score. So I'm using my Teflon Bold folder to score at 3 inches and 10/16. This panel is going to be slightly smaller so that it folds in and doesn't give me any problems with the other piece of paper folding over. And then I'm going to flip it over, and on the other side I am going to score at 3 inches and 11/16. So this will be the flap that covers and is actually the front of the card. When you do your scoring, make sure you do it with the cut side of your paper up, so that will fold into your card and not be on the outside edge. Even though we've scored, this doesn't always mean that your paper is going to line up perfectly. So before you really press it down with that bone folder, make sure that your edges line up and that your card is flush with itself. I kind of had to mess around with the second folding of it just to make sure everything was good to go before I moved on to the die cutting. So I used the second smallest rectangle in that set, and I chose this because I knew the front of the card was going to be pretty plain, all the fun's on the inside, but I liked the idea of having that stitched border. So when you're die cutting, whatever window it is, you want to make sure that you open up your card completely, because we only want to cut through one layer. You don't want to cut through everything, and if you leave it folded up, you'll cut through a bunch of the layers of paper. So once that was done, I went ahead and removed the die, and there was some adhesive that was left on my paper, which caused a little bit of panic because I thought I ripped the paper. It turns out just adhesive, thank God. So I just used a white eraser to pick that up. You don't really want to rub that with your fingers because you can transfer ink or dirt, or in my case, a lot of times makeup. So now once I have that all done, I'm going to fold the card up, and then I'm just going to lightly trace a square onto that inside panel so I know where I want to do my stamping. I knew I was going to be doing some distress inking in my background, not to mention I don't want my stamping to go over the panel. So I'm using some post-it note. I think this is like 1.5 inch post-its, I think, to just mask that back panel so I don't get any stamping or ink or anything over on that side. Keeps everything nice and clean. And then I'm going to do some stamping with my Intense Black ink from Simon Says Stamp. This is Copic friendly, and I am going to be doing everything with Copic coloring outside of the background colors. So I'm lining up this gnome so that he is in the window. None of him is hanging over because I'm going to pop him up. It's not necessary to stamp him and mask him, but it helps me for placement when I'm doing the rest of it one layer. And I'm just going to stamp and mask as I go. The reason this video is so long, besides the fact that coloring just takes a while, is because I made a lot of mistakes. And I'm going to show you every single one of them, because nobody is perfect, no crafter is perfect. Even if it's something that you do all the time, like I do, that doesn't mean that we don't make errors, and there are ways to fix them, because if you have watched my videos before, you know I don't start over. So mistake number one, this stamping right here. This needs to be behind my gnome, which the foot on the right, it is behind it, but because of the way the stamp is angled, I now have a gnome that's just standing in the middle of these leaves. Like, legitimately, his foot is on top of the leaves, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I finished stamping out the rest of my scene. I felt like I wanted something in the right hand. Mistake number two. You can see as I'm stamping this mushroom down, the fence post for that leaf is ending in the middle of my mushroom, because I was just so worried about the layout and where things were going to go that I wasn't paying attention to the rest of that stamped image. So I'm going to use some more post-it tape to just go ahead and mask off the ground so that I can do some distress inking. This is just a really good way to get really intense color and not have to waste your Copic ink. So everything's masked, and I'm going to put down some Salty Ocean pretty heavy over the sky, because remember, when you look at it from the front, all you're going to be able to see is just that square. So I wanted to make sure I had really good coverage. Once I was happy with the way that that looked, I'm going to go ahead and remove the mask on the bottom, and then I'm going to move it up to mask the blue to do my grass. Now, while we're doing this, pay attention to that little mushroom down there on the right-hand side that no longer has a mask. The mask is gone. It no longer has a mask. But I don't know this. I'm just doing my thing. I'm ink blending away, not even paying no attention to the fact that that thing is not masked anymore. So as I'm doing it, here's where I realize there's no mask. And I'm like, what is happening? I'm talking to myself. You can see through the hand motions. So I check and see, sure enough, it's stuck to the back of my masking paper. So make sure you pay attention to that if you're pulling up large pieces of mask. Here's how I tried to fix it. This is not watercolor cardstock. This is Nina. So I'm going in with very, very little water and blotting it up. I can only do this because they're distressings and they react with water. And I'm using just a teeny tiny amount of water. It totally worked. It's not white, but it's not green either. So I know I'm going to be able to, once I get through the coat of coloring, nobody's going to be able to tell. Gonna go ahead and remove all of my masks so that everything is nice and clean. Here's where those stamping mistakes really become apparent, because everything is stark white and now you have that color in the background, and it's really easy to notice all of the errors that I made. So we're going to start with their skin tone. I colored both the gnomes the same way because this was very time consuming. The technique isn't, but kind of showing you all the steps is, and then also just mad amounts of coat coloring, just forever. So for the shading, he's going to have some shading on his ears underneath his hat, especially since his is kind of cocked. The right-hand side of his face is going to be a little bit darker. I start with my lightest color and work out to my darkest, and then from my darkest back out to my lightest. That's just how I roll, how I feel like I get the best blend. I did add a little bit of shading right above his beard on his cheeks, but none on his nose. So I'm just working back out to that lightest color so that there is a good blend. Right now it's going to look really dark, but it's because we basically have no other colors going on in the background. Then I'm going to move on to their little shirts. I actually Googled gnomes. I Googled gnomes and looked at images because I wanted to make sure that I was like coloring traditional gnomes. It seemed like gnomes just came in all colors. They just, everything that they were wearing, they were doing was in all colors, except all their beards were white. Like, that never changed. There was never like a brown bearded gnome. But for his shirt, I am putting some shading underneath his arms, where his little armpits are, and then also underneath his vest and underneath his beard, because those things would all cast a shadow. I am not whatsoever working with any sort of light source. However, out of habit, I tend to color as if my light source is in the top right hand corner, which is how I colored this gnome. But it doesn't matter, because I'm showing you me coloring this flat gnome because it's easier than having to keep moving another piece of paper in and out. But ultimately, I colored a completely different gnome the same way so that I could die cut it and pop it up over this one. So I'm coloring this one just for teaching purposes, so I don't have to keep moving things around. For the gnome on top, I colored him the same way. His shading is going to be underneath his beard and the crook of his arm. Again, on the underneath of his arm where it would be darker. And then on his shirt where the heart and his arms are resting kind of on his belly. Every single time, lightest to darkest, darkest to lightest. I don't typically venture away from there unless there's an area that is super tiny and I need to go in with my darkest color first, just because I can't risk the edges bleeding, but that very rarely happens. For their pants, I decided to go pretty neutral with some grays. I'm starting with a C5, just going to fill in the entire thing with that. Go back in with my C9, add some shading underneath his shirt and then on the inner thigh of his shorts. And then the same thing with the black. I'll blend out the black with the C9 and then cap off just the highlights, which are very tiny, with that C5 again. The gnome up above him got the same treatment. I decided I was going to go with my favorite brown combination for the fence on the leafy area. And this was really simple, just really simple shading. This particular layout kind of made things a little bit confusing as far as what belonged to what, because I got the mushrooms, I got the gnome in front of it, I got these crazy leaves going on. So sometimes it can be a little difficult to see what needs to be shaded. I do miss some of the posts, but I'll catch it later. So the way that the posts are drawn is so that they are three-dimensional. They have two sides. So just pick one, whichever floats your boat, and make one side darker than the other to help give you some dimension. I'm also adding just a little bit of shading where the bars will meet, where they're crossed. There would be a little bit of shading. And then typically I shade kind of like from the bottom up a little bit so that there's just some definition. I didn't even bother going back in with the 5-7. I just blended everything out with the 5-5 because these are really tiny areas and it's not something that's particularly eye-catching in this card. For anything that I am coloring white, I am using this combination of a C1, a C3, and a C5. Starting with my little gnome's beard, I am going to add some darker shading where his hair is coming out from underneath his hat, because typically the hair on a man's head is darker than his beard anyway. So there would also be shadows from the hat. So for the texture of his beard, I just really added a couple of little lines. Nothing, too fancy, just so that it wasn't a solid color. Using the same combination to color the white parts of my mushrooms, so the underneath and the stalks. I'm also going to color the cap of the mushroom with the whites. I'm going to shade it. The reason that is I'm not going to make the entire mushroom white. But I am going to make those little dots white, and rather than have to try and shade each individual dot, it's so much easier to just do your grays first, because I know that the red's going to cover it up anyway. So it doesn't even matter. For the actual, where I put the shading, it's going to be darker around the edges because it's a round object. It's also going to be darker, a dark line closest to the cap because that's going to fall behind, and then away from the center will be darker. I added just a little bit of shading toward the base because those leaves are in front of it. I wanted it to look a little bit further behind. And again, I'm just going to blend everything out. Because these things are white, when you're coloring an object white, you want to leave some white in. Don't completely cover it up with your grays or it's going to be gray. I went ahead and did all of the stalks of the mushrooms and the cap on the larger mushroom. And then I realized how much red I was going to have in this. It's going to have so much red. And so I didn't want anything that was going to be kind of contradictory. But I didn't want just the same tone of red. So what I opted to do was bring in some oranges. I used a YR04, an 09, and a R29 for his vest. And then I also used it for a couple of the mushrooms. The reason why this works is it kind of gives the appearance of almost like a tomato red versus a more pink red. And so they don't compete with each other, but they do just add a little bit of difference. You can see the green mushroom down there on the bottom. You really can't even see any of that green anymore. We were able to pull it up. It is slightly darker than the rest of the mushrooms, but I don't really think it's a big deal. For the caps and the mushrooms, you want to make the tops of them slightly darker because they are further away from what you would be looking at. The highlight would be on the side because it's a round object. Now we're finally going to get into the reds. This is kind of my go-to combination for reds. It is more on the pink side, but it just happens to be my favorite one. So here, it can be challenging to get a good blend when you have to color around objects. What I typically like to do is I put down a line of color where I know it's going to be the darkest. I flick out where I can. And then once I've kind of outlined the object, like the circle, like the spot that's on the far right-hand side, I outline it first and then flick away from the line that I've already put down. I don't tend to just flick the color because I am just messy that way. So I'm adding in the darkest shading on the outside edges, again, because this is a round object, we want that highlight to be in the center. I also added a little bit of shading underneath his feet because he is standing on top of this mushroom. And then I'm just going to bring those colors more toward the center, leaving a highlight in the exact center of it. Because like I said, I'm not really working with a light source, so I'm kind of coloring everything just as it had a center light. For their hats, I colored them both the same way. In hindsight, I probably should have done the white first. I didn't have my C1 pick up any of the red and carry it, thank God, but it was a distinct possibility. So if you're coloring anything where you're going to have red and white right next to each other, do the white first, because the red isn't going to pick up the white and carry it, but the white certainly can pick up the red and carry it. So this is the same thing because it's a round object. All of the shading is going to be on the outside edges. I know when things are tiny, it can be difficult to conserve that highlight, but really try your best to do so because that's what's going to give you the dimension. Even on the part at the top where there's just not a lot of real estate at all, I forewent the darker shading. I wasn't heavy-handed with it so that I could keep that highlight because that highlight's what's going to give it the round appearance. The last thing that I'm going to do right on camera is this heart. And again, the shading is going to be from the outside. That's where his hands are holding it. So there would be the darkest parts there where he'd be grasping it. And then it's the same thing every time, folks. I mean, I feel like I'm a broken record. You probably, if you watch these consistently, and I hope that you do, I hope you enjoy them and that you learn something from each technique that we try together. But I'm constantly saying lightest to darkest, darkest to lightest, lightest to darkest, darkest to lightest. Anywho, so now I'm going to go back in and do the white, because I'm going rogue and throwing caution to the wind and thinking I ain't going to pick up no red. Crazy person. But so I added the darkest shading again on the outside. I skipped the C5 at first and then I felt like it just didn't have enough contrast. So I'm going back in and just adding a line of the C5 to make sure everything stays nice and white. I picked up a couple of the YG01 is pretty much a dead match for the Twisted Citron Distress ink. I mean, it's almost exactly the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in with that first, just all of the areas. And then for the shading, I'm going to go in and pick out the parts that are actually leaves. I'm only going to show you one because I did the same thing each time. I shaded the darker in the center down over the top. So I used some rounded strokes on the tops because it is kind of folding over and curling down. So I wanted to look like that. I did fill in the background pieces that weren't leaves with the darkest color so that they would just be green, nondescript in the background, and then I went ahead and colored the rest of the leaves. Now, remember, I have a fence in the middle of my mushroom, so I gotta fix it. Gotta fix it, folks. Can't just leave it that way. It looks crazy. So I filled in the green as high as I needed it to be for the fence to be actually on grass. Now I'm going to start doing some shading. We're going to trick people. That's what we're going to do. I have to. At this juncture, I have no choice. So I'm adding some darker shading underneath all of my elements so that they appear to be, sitting in the grass, casting a little bit of a shadow, what have you. But it's most important for that fence post on top of the mushroom to have that darker shading. I'm going to start adding in some texture with the darkest color. I'm using a flicking motion and a very light hand. This is going to help give me the illusion of that grass. It's going to help me hide that black line from that mushroom where I misstamped it. So I'm just going to keep adding this in. I did speed it up because I did this with every single one of the colors and it was very, very long. So I'm going to speed it up. I'm not this fast in real life. But just doing the same thing, little flicks of colors, bringing the darker colors down and the lighter ones down farther each time. For the YG03, I covered the entire thing, but I did go back in with the YG01 to kind of blend everything out. So now it looks like they're standing in a field of grass, and it's very difficult to see that black line from the mushroom. I'm going to add in some white details. If you had any bleeding when you were like doing the mushrooms or anything, you can hit it with a white gel pen to clean up those edges. I also wanted to add some spots to the mushrooms that are kind of in the field so that they would have some detail and they wouldn't be just kind of so plain Jane out there. So I'm just doing a couple of little sprinkles on top. And then this is what's going to seal the deal and really hide the mushroom. I'm going to add this black line at the base of it. And that's going to make it look like it stops right there. And so then you don't really notice that other black line because of all the other shading. For the guy that I stamped in the middle, because of what his expression is, it almost looked like he was jumping up. So I opted to roll with it. We rolling. I don't have a choice. I mean, I stamped him in the middle of the card. So I just drew a little shadow underneath him. I'm going to outline everything with a Copic Safe writing pen because that's how I roll. And then here's this other gnome that I told you about that I had colored on another piece. It's the same thing, Nina cardstock. And then I'm just going to run that through my Big Shot and die cut him out. I wanted to stamp my sentiment before I adhered him since he is going to be on foam tape. I'm using black Simon Says stamping for that. It's a good crisp ink for stamping sentiments. I wanted to make sure I stamped that sentiment high enough that you're not going to be able to see it through the opening, through the window panel. Because it's just supposed to look like this cute little gnome, you know, peeking through, and then you open and it's like, bam, whole landscape scene, crazy going on. Really simple front. I really love the whole concept of it. So I popped him up on some Scotch foam tape so that he kind of pops out of the window, makes it a little bit more interesting. And then from there, the last thing that I did was just add some clear Wink of Stella because everything needs shines, even the gnomies. So I added all that, and then that is it. So I hope that you guys will give this a try. I hope that you learned something and enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I'll catch you on the next video. Bye.